In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create your own asset libraries using Blender's asset browser. So in this video, I'll show you how to mark things as assets, and we'll be going over materials, models, collections of objects, and also HDRIs. Then I'll show you how to add custom names to the assets and sort them into catalogs, and I'll show you how to add custom thumbnails, and then I'll also show you how to set up those asset libraries that you've made so you can just open up any Blender file and just drag and drop the assets into your projects. Now before we start the tutorial, I wanted to let you know about my asset library products. So I have my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, which comes with all of my procedural materials. They're all pre-set up in the asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. So you can just drag and drop the materials into your projects to add materials to your 3D scenes. Now I also have a furniture and home asset pack, which comes with many different furniture and home 3D models. And again, you can just drag and drop the furniture and home models into your 3D scenes to quickly create a home environment. And I'm also selling a Christmas ornaments asset pack, which comes with many different Christmas ornament 3D models. So if you're creating a holiday scene, you can just drag and drop the Christmas ornaments onto a Christmas tree or into any of your other holiday scenes. If you'd like to watch the product trailer videos, the links will be in the description, and you can also check out the product pages linked in the description. And all of your support really does make these free videos possible. So the first thing you should do when you're setting up asset libraries is you should make some folder where you want to store all the assets. Now you can make different asset libraries and store them on different places on your computer, but it kind of makes sense to keep things organized and just keep all of your asset libraries in one folder. So just for an example, in this tutorial on my desktop, I have a folder where I have my assets, and then I have some different folders for some wood materials. I also have some low poly nature assets, some HDRIs, and then also some furniture models, which are made out of collections, so there are multiple objects in one collection. And you don't have to create different folders with the different assets. You can just have one Blender file with all of your assets if you like to, but I kind of like to split it up just so things aren't too complicated. So I'm just going to have some different folders, and I'll show you how to set these up. We're first going to start with just normal objects. So I'm going to show you how to set up these low poly nature assets, and this is actually a tutorial that I created a while back. If you want to check out that video, link will be in the description. Now it's very important that you set up your asset library somewhere where you won't move the assets and you won't move any of the models or the textures, because if you move the asset library or if you move the textures, Blender's going to lose the data because it won't know where the file is located on your computer's hard drive. So just make sure you find a nice place. Again, you could make a folder on your computer, you could call it asset libraries, and then just store all of your assets there, and that way you won't have to move them around and Blender won't lose the data. So I'm going to go into this low poly nature folder, and then I have the low poly nature assets, and then I also just have this HDRI. The HDRI is just used to light the scene. And then if you have any textures on your model, you could leave the textures here inside the folder, or you could also leave them in like a texture folder on your computer. But the important thing is to just make sure you don't move the textures, because Blender uses the file path of where the texture is located to find the texture when it's rendering. So if you move the texture data, Blender will lose that data. So I'm going to open up the file with my low poly assets. Now before we mark these as assets, let's say that you have some other maybe materials or objects or data in another Blender file, and you want to compile them all together into the same Blender file so you can mark them all as assets. Well, to do that, it's really easy using Blender's append feature. So let's say I didn't have this mountain in this file and I wanted to add the low poly mountain into this file, but maybe I created it in a separate project. Well, to do that, I could just click on File, I can click on Append, and Blender's file browser will appear, and I can just locate to the other Blender file where I have the data, and I can go inside that Blender file. And then I need to choose the folder, and in this case, I'm adding an object, so I'll just go to the Objects folder, and I can add in the mountain object. So now the mountain object has been added into this Blender file. And you can do that as many times as you want to add in lots of different data into the same Blender file. So we now need to mark these as assets, and the easiest way to do that is to use the outliner. So again, in this part of the tutorial, I'm just marking objects as assets, but later in the video, I'll go over collections and materials and HDRIs. So I'll open up the outliner and I'll open this up, and you can see we have all these objects. So I'll just click and drag to box select all of the models, and when you select all the models in the 3D viewport, they're also going to be selected in the outliner. So now I can just right click on the models and they're all selected, and then we can just click on the mark as asset. So choose that, and now you can see that there's kind of like a little book icon, and so now it's marking all of these as assets. Now to actually see the assets, we need to open up the asset browser, and the easiest way to do that is to just click in the corner of the window, and you can click and drag to split the window, and then you can click on this button to change the editor type, and I'll change it to the asset browser. You can see it has the same book icon. Now these are some different asset libraries that I've already created in Blender. What I'm going to do is go to current file. So if this isn't already there, just go to current file, and you can see that Blender has now marked all of these as assets. Let me just click on this arrow and drag down. So here's the asset browser, and you can click on this button here and then change the size. So I can make the size smaller, and you can also search for assets. So if I wanted to like type in flower, I can see just all the flower assets, and you can see that the names on default, they're going to be the same names as the objects because I've renamed all the objects to mushrooms and mountains and grass and so on. Now with your mouse hovered in the asset browser, you can press the N key to open the side panel, and this is going to give you some more settings. So for example, let's say I want to rename the stump model, so the object is called stump, but on the name here I could rename it to tree stump. You can also add tags. So for example, this log here, maybe I want the log to show up when I type in tree because log is made out of wood. So what I can do is click on the plus here to add a new tag, and I can rename this to tree. Now if I go to the search here and type in tree, you can see the log is going to show up because it has the tree tag. So even though it's not actually a tree and tree isn't in the name, it's still going to show up because of the tag. Now you can see Blender is automatically going to render out the previews, but the previews really don't look that nice. You can see like this grass for some reason is rotated over to the side, and there might be other issues like the log is straight up and down, and they also don't have materials on them. Now one simple solution, for example this log here, if I wanted to rotate the log, that is because the log's default rotation is rotated up, but if I wanted this to be the default rotation, I could select the log, I could press Ctrl A, and I could apply the rotation, and then I could click on this reload button, and this will regenerate a preview. And now you can see that it looks a bit better, although the camera view is kind of from this angle, but you can see the log is rotated over. So you can try regenerating the thumbnails to make it look a bit nicer. However, you can also add in your own custom thumbnails. So what you can do is render out custom thumbnails, and that way they actually have lighting and materials. And so I've just rendered out these 2 square images, and I would recommend keeping them at a small file size because they're really not going to be that big. They're just little thumbnails. So I'm just rendering them as small little images here. And then back in Blender, you can select an object. So I can select the log, and I can click on this file icon. Then I can locate to my folder with the thumbnails. I can select the log one, click on load custom preview, and now you can see we have this nice log image. I'll do that also for the flower. And of course you could render them all out, but I'm not going to do that for this video. But of course you can render out all of the different thumbnails, and then you can add custom thumbnails for all of your assets. Now what you can also do is you can organize these into catalogs. So if you press the T key to open up the side panel, there's going to be different catalogs here. So right now there's just all, and that is just going to be all of them. And then there's unassigned, and unassigned is if none of them are in any of the catalogs. So you can click on the plus here to add a new catalog, and I could, for example, rename this to trees. Then if I click back on unassigned, I could click on some of the trees. So here's the puffy tree, the tall tree, and the pine tree, and I'll click and drag them and drop them into the trees. And now you can see they're not in the unassigned, they're just in the trees one. I could also make another one here. I'll just call this flowers. I can go back to unassigned, and I can hold down the control key and select all the flowers, put them in the flowers. Now if you click on the trees here, you can actually make another catalog in this catalog. So I'll click on the plus here, and I could rename this other catalog to pine. I'll click on the plus here again, and I'll rename this to fruit because we can add fruit trees. And then if I click on trees, I can put the pine tree in the pine, and I can put the apple tree into the fruit. So now I can click on this one and I can just see the fruit trees or the pine trees or all the trees, or I can go back to all to see all the assets. So if you have a large asset library, this can be super useful for organizing your assets. Now you can see that there are these little star icons, the asterisks next to the names, and that's Blender telling us that it hasn't saved the catalogs yet. So if you press Ctrl S to save the project, that should save the catalogs, or you can also click on this button right here. You can see it's grayed out. I don't have anything to save, but you can click on that button there to save the asset. assets. Now, when you create catalogs, you might notice in your Blender file that Blender has created the blender assets.cats text file. Now, if you go into this file, this is going to give Blender the data of where to save the assets. So it has some weird numbers and letters here. It has trees and then /pine, and then it has trees pine. So Blender's basically using this data to create the catalogs. So you don't want to delete this folder. You don't want to move it. Again, you just want to leave it where it is. Just leave it in the same folder with your nature assets file. And that way Blender knows where to get to this data so it can create the catalogs. So once you've saved the file, you can just close this and we can now open up a completely new Blender file. So in a completely new Blender file, I can click here on the corner and I can drag out to split the window, and I can click here to change the editor type, and I can change this to the asset browser. Now again, you're not going to see all of these. These are the other assets that I've made, but if you don't have any, if I just click here on current file, you're not going to be able to see the assets because the assets aren't in this current file. And if you haven't set up the asset library in the asset browser, you're not going to see the different asset libraries. So what you can do is click on edit, and then you can go to Blender's preferences. Now in the preferences, you want to click here on file paths, and then you want to open up the asset libraries tab here. And again, you won't see all of these because I've set up a bunch of my own asset libraries, but to create a new asset library, you can click on this plus icon. So what you now want to do is you want to locate to the folder where you've saved that Blender file. So for me, it is the low poly nature folder, and you can't actually see the Blender file. You can just see the folder, but this is where the Blender file is. And I'm going to click on add asset library. So now you can rename this. I'll just rename this to low poly nature 3D models. Now it's really important to click on the save preferences button if you want to be able to have this in any of your Blender projects. So you can just open up Blender or open up an existing project and drag and drop the models into your scene. So make sure you click on the save preferences button. So once you've clicked on that, you can close the user preferences. And now if you click right here, you'll be able to have all your asset libraries. So again, I have a bunch of asset libraries that I've already made, but you can see here's the one we just created, the low poly nature 3D models. So if I click on that, now we have all the models in this file, and I could open up a new file or an existing file, and these assets would be here because we set it up in Blender's user preferences. So you can just find any assets you want, you can click and drag, and you can just drop the models into your 3D scenes. So you can quickly build up a 3D scene, whether you have nature assets like these low poly nature assets or city assets, or really whatever models you have, like the furniture assets from my furniture asset pack, you can drag and drop them into your scene and quickly build up a 3D environment. And what's really cool about the asset browser is when you're dragging in objects, the objects are going to snap to another object. So if I want to like put an object here on this mountain, I can just drop that there. And now you can see I can add the grass to the mountain. But then of course you can manually move the objects, you can rotate them and scale them and just place them in your scene. And if you click right here in the corner on the very top and click and drag down, then you have these different settings. So of course you can go to the search. So I could type in flower, then I can just see the flower assets and I can drop those into my scene. I could also click on this button here to change the size. So I can change the size of the previews. And again, if you press the N key to open the side panel or click on the gear icon, you can see there is the preview and the tags. Now you can see these are grayed out. These buttons here are grayed out. And that's because this is not the original file. So if you want to change the data for the original file, like adding tags and changing the preview, you need to go back to the low poly nature assets Blender file with the original assets, and then you can actually edit the asset. Now there's another option right up here on the top, and this is the import method. So the default one, which I believe is set for the preferences, is the append reuse data. So for example, let's say I add in this bush model, drop this here, and then I add in another bush model and drop this here. Now let's say that I want to edit this bush model so that it's like a different shape. Now if I go into edit mode and then I select a vertex and try to move it, you can see the other bush model is being edited the same way. And this is because when we added in the model, it's reusing the data. So these objects are basically copied so they have the same object's data. So to fix this, I can delete this one, and on the append reuse data, I'll just change it to append. Now I can add in the bush model, and if I go into edit mode, I can move this around and I can scale it and I can edit the object in edit mode, but it won't affect the other object. Now also there's one more type here, which is the link. And what the link will do is it will make an exact copy of the other file from the original assets file, but using the linked import method means that you won't be able to edit the assets in this file. So if I change this to link and then I drag in this bush model, you can see there's the bush model if I bring it over here. But the problem with this is that I can't move it, I can't scale it, and I can't go into edit mode. So it's basically just stuck where it is. However, if I went back to the original Blender file where I created the assets, I could edit this object. And then when I went back to this Blender file, the object would be changed. So I really don't use this for that many things. Usually I just use the append type. So I'll now show you how to set up materials in Blender. So for this example, I'm going to be using my procedural wood material pack, and all of these wood materials are in my ultimate Blender procedural material pack. So if you'd like to purchase these, you can check out my ultimate material pack, or if you'd like to just purchase these 10 wood materials, you can check out my Blender procedural wood material pack 1. Link to that product will be in the description. Now these wood materials are created procedurally, but if you have materials which are using texture maps, it'll work exactly the same way. You just need to make sure that you store the texture map somewhere on your computer where you won't move the texture map so Blender won't lose the data. So to add in the materials, we want to again go here to the outliner, but if you open up the outliner, you can see these are just the objects which the materials are on. And I just want to add the material data as an asset, but I don't want to add the objects. So to add just the material as an asset, you can click on the arrow here, and then you can click on the other arrow, and then finally right down here in the bottom of these arrows here, there's going to be the actual material, which is this little red circle. And you can right click and then you can click on mark as asset. Now there's an easier way to do this if you have lots of materials. So what you can do instead is click on this button here, and instead of view layer, we want to click on Blender file. So this will show us all the data in the Blender file, and we can open up materials. Now I can just open this up so it's much bigger, and I can click on the bottom one, hold down the shift key, click on the top one so they're all selected, and then you can just right click and then you can click on mark as asset. So you can see they're all going to be marked as assets, and you can see that there's the little book icons showing us that they're being marked as assets. Now I can actually hear my computer fans getting a bit louder because right now it's rendering out all the thumbnails. So with materials, it'll actually render out a thumbnail of that material. So if I click here in the corner and then drag out, I can split the window, and then again I can change the editor type to the asset browser, and then you want to of course change this to current file if it's not set to that already. And you can see Blender is automatically actually rendering out preview images, and it kind of adds like a lighting setup, so there's a light with a shadow. Now again, these preview images don't really look that good. They're kind of at an odd rotation, and some of them are a bit big or a bit small. So if you press the N key to open up the side panel, you can again add a preview just like we did before. You can add the description, you can change the name and add tags, but you can also add a preview just like I talked about earlier. So I'll click on the file icon. Then I can go into the folder with all my product renders, and I can just choose the tree bark. So I'll just choose that one. I can also click on wood 1, and I can click on wood 1 here. So again, these are all the thumbnails which I've rendered out. So I'll click on that one there, and I can just continue to do that for all the assets. So once you've added all the thumbnail images, you can again sort them into the catalogs, just like I mentioned earlier in the video. So then again, of course, click on this button here to save the blender.cats file, or press Ctrl S to save the Blender file. You can close the Blender file, and again, you can see there's the blender assets.cats text file. And again, this is just the data that Blender is using to create the catalogs and organize them. Then you can open up a completely new file or an existing file. You can click on Edit. You can go to the preferences, and just like we did before, you can go to File Paths, you can go to Asset Libraries, and click on the plus icon. You can then go to the folder where the material file is. You can click on Add Asset Library. You can then rename the asset library right here, and then again click on the Save Preferences. So then in any of your projects, if you click in the corner and drag out to split the window, you can change it to the asset browser, and then you can choose the wood materials, and now you have all the wood materials. Now because these are materials instead of objects, when you drag and drop them in, you need to drag and drop them in on an object, because they are not object assets, they are just material assets, so you have to actually drag them over a model and then let go just to drop them in. And if you purchase my ultimate Blender procedural material pack, you'll get over 200 procedural materials. You can see they're all pre-set up in the asset browser, and if you jump over to the shader editor, you can see that all of the materials in my ultimate material pack have these custom node groups, so you can control the look of the material. And they're sorted into lots of different catalogs, so we have abstract materials, We have metal materials, we have marble materials, concrete materials, and so many more different materials. Now, if you have multiple objects and you want those objects to be their own asset, but you don't want to join the objects together, you can join the objects into a collection and then mark the collection as an asset. And I'll be doing that for the furniture models. So just for an example, I have a few furniture models here, and these are just a few models from my furniture and home asset pack. So for example, I have this chair here and I have this controller object and the other objects are parented to it. So this way all the objects are separate because this is kind of a complex 3D model. So I don't want to join them together into one object, but then I want all of these to be as one asset so I can drag and drop the models into my projects. So to join all the models into a collection, you can just select all the objects, and then what you can do is press the M key and then you can click on New Collection. You can then make the name, so I can just call this lamp, and I can click on create, and now you can see in the outliner there is this collection called lamp, and if I open this up you can see there's all the objects in that collection. So you can just do that for as many objects as you want, and then to mark these as assets, instead of clicking on the object and marking it as an asset, you'll want to click on the collection, so right click on the collection, and then you can click on mark as asset. And you can see now next to the collection, again it has that book icon, so I'm going to click on the other ones, right click, and I will mark them as asset. So again, if I click and drag to split the window and change the editor type to the asset browser, I can choose current file, and you can see it's going to render out preview images of the different assets. Now this time it does kind of have like a material preview mode, so you can see some of the textures because there's textures on the models, but these really don't look that great. This one's all gray, and this one kind of has some gray spots, and the lighting isn't really that nice. So again, you can press the N key for the side panel, and you can click on the file icon to add in your own rendered thumbnails. So now the preview images look much nicer because I've rendered out nice images with good lighting. And then again, you can do the same thing. So you can click on the plus here to add catalogs. You can rename the catalogs and then just save the catalogs file. In a new Blender file, you can go to Blender's user preferences. On the file path, you can click on the plus here to add a new asset library. And you can go into the folder with the furniture models. You can choose add asset library. And then in Blender's asset browser, you can choose your furniture models. And then I can just drag and drop the assets into my 3D viewport. Now, when you're adding in collections, there's a few things which work a bit differently. One thing that you might notice is that it adds like this empty here, and then it adds the model wherever the model was in the 3D viewport instead of the very center. Now, if you want to fix this, you could go back to your Blender file and you could move the model into the very center, and you could overlap all the models in the very center, and that way when you add them in, they will be in the center where the empty is. However, the other problem with this is that this is as an instance, so if I select this object and try to go into edit mode, or if I try to select individual objects, I can't select them. So I'm just going to delete this asset. What I want to do instead is drag in the desk and drop it here. And then if you go here to the add collection settings, right after you add in the asset, you want to click on this instance button here just to turn that off. So now that you've turned that off, you can see that I can select each one of the objects, I can move it around, and then I can select the shelves, and I've kind of added a basic rigging setup so you can open up the shelves. So now I can move all these objects together as an asset, but all the objects are still separate. And if you purchase my furniture and home asset pack, then you'll get lots of furniture and home 3D models. They're all pre-set up in the asset browser, and you can just drag and drop them into your 3D scenes, and you can quickly create a home environment. And my furniture and home asset pack comes with bathroom and bedroom assets, dining room assets, kitchen assets, living room assets, and office assets. So the last type of assets I'll show you how to add is HDRIs. So I have this file with some HDRIs, and just for an example, I just have 4 HDRIs, and I downloaded these HDRIs from polyhaven.com. Polyhaven.com is a really great website for downloading free high quality HDRIs. So I'll open up a new Blender file, and I'm going to click over here to go to the world properties, and I'll go into the rendered viewport mode so I can see the HDRI in the viewport. So what I'm going to do now is add the different worlds with the HDRIs, and then I can mark the worlds as an asset. So right here next to color, I'll click on the yellow dot, I'll choose environment texture, and I'll click on open. Then I can locate to the folder with the HDRIs. I'll first choose this one, and you can see here's the HDRI. And if you want to edit the HDRI, you can go here to the shading. So on the shading tab, you can click on object here on the shader type, and I'll choose world instead. And if you want to, you can change things like the strength, or you could change the colors or add more nodes in here to change the look of the HDRI. But I don't want to do any of that, so I'll go back here to the layout. So now what I can do is right click right here on the world icon and I can mark as asset. So now that I've marked that as an asset, I also want to rename this. So I'll just rename it to the same exact HDRI name. Then what I can do is click on the exit here to get rid of it, but it's still here in the Blender file. I'll click on new to add a new world. And then again on the yellow dot, I'll click here and I will choose environment texture and I will click on open to open up the next HDRI. Then you can go to the folder with your HDRIs and I will choose the next one here. And again, I will add the same exact name. So I'll just copy this name, the autumn field pure sky, and I'll paste that there. And then I can right click and I can mark it as asset. And then I'll just do the same thing for the other HDRIs. So now again, if you click and drag in the corner to split the window, you can click on the editor type and I'll choose the asset browser. And again, if you go to current file, you can now see there's all the HDRIs. And again, if you want to, you can add different previews. So you could like render out a large preview so you can see what the HDRI looks like. And you can of course sort them into catalogs. So you could add like a pure sky, you could add nighttime scenes and day scenes and indoor scenes and outdoor scenes and create a nice catalog to sort all your assets. And then again, just make sure you save the file. So I will just click on file and I will save this file. I will just save this file as HDRIs.blend and I'll save it in my HDRIs folder and I will click on save as and I can now just close this file. So now in a new Blender file, I will go edit and I will go here to the preferences. And again, we can go to file path, we can go to asset libraries and click on the plus here to add a new asset library. I'll just locate to the HDRIs folder and I can't see the Blender file, but I know it's here and I'll click on add asset library. And then again, make sure to click on the save preferences button so it's always in your future projects. So now I can go into the rendered viewport mode and I can split the window and change the editor type to the asset browser. And then I can go here to my HDRIs. And now because this is a world, if I click here on the world to see the world properties, I can just drag and drop each one of the worlds and it's going to add the different world settings here as an asset. So here's the autumn field, here's the cart club, and here's the airport one, and I can quickly just change between all these. And this is really helpful if you have like a 3D environment, but you don't know which HDRI to use. You can just quickly drag and drop them and see how the lighting looks on your model. And if you'd like to purchase any of my asset library products to use in your projects, you can check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack. You can also check out my Furniture and Home Asset Pack, and you can also check out my Christmas Ornaments Asset Pack, which comes with many different Christmas ornament 3D models, so you can just drag and drop the Christmas ornaments onto a Christmas tree or any of your holiday scenes. So links will be in the description if you'd like to check out any of my asset packs. But I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you for watching.